Today I want to show you guys some of the things that the aperture in a camera can control and kind of just what you should expect from just various settings and things you can do with it. The lens that I'm using today is a 50mm f1.1. It is overly bright. It is not very accurate. It's not very sharp, but it is probably one of the better lenses for showing how bokeh and how the out of focus areas work. There's a few different ways to pronounce bokeh. I like saying it bokeh. I think it's bokeh or something like that is the actual right way to say it, but it doesn't really matter. I like bokeh. For this setup, what I've done is I've put my camera on a tripod, and then right in front of me, I have some Christmas lights that are at dead minimum focus for this lens, which looks like about 2.5 to 3 feet. And then going out on the floor up to, I would say, maybe 25 or 30 feet away from me is the remainder of the string of Christmas lights going to the wall over there. Now, that was that was racking the focus from point to point. That was going from dead minimum here, which is at 2 feet, which is these little lights up here. You can see that even in the in-focus parts, this lens is very soft. And then the out-of-focus parts there, and if I roll my focus towards them, you can see the out-of-focus area become sharper and sharper. Now, the reason I'm using Christmas lights for this is that you can see the out-of-focus areas as more prescribed circles. So those perfect circles you're seeing are the individual lights as point lights being blown out across that. So you can imagine the focus of a camera, the out of focus areas just being a bunch of those circles overlapping and overlapping and overlapping until they get smooth. Because it's not a point source of light, you don't get the hard edges. This lens has what's called soap bubble bokeh, and not serious, but just a little bit, where you get a bright edge on the object, on the out of focus object. So especially in the blues, you can see some of those blue ones and some of the green ones have a bright edge on them that's brighter than the center. When that gets really, really bad, it's referred to as soap bubble bokeh. So I'm going to be at my minimum focus. From this minimum focus, I'm also at my maximum aperture. I'm at aperture 1.1. If I go to 1.4, I have a smooth aperture ring where it does not click. For most people, this will click from one thing to the other. I actually prefer a clicked aperture, but that's not what the lens came with, so it's not what I got. So 1.1 to 1.4, and you can see those spheres, or sorry, not spheres, you can see those circles get smaller. And these are those convergent beams that we looked at when I was talking about how cameras work. This is the fact that that infinitely small point source that should be infinitely small on this sensor is not, because we're in the out of focus areas where it has come up apart, where the convergence, we're on the other side of convergence. I'm going to stop this down slowly. My camera will darken and then it will slowly try to get brighter because it is floating the ISO to make the brightness correct. That's the top, that's f16 on this lens. Now we can kind of see what's going on in the rest of the image, and this tripod in the foreground that we're actually focused on is very, very sharp. But we can see that we're not actually perfectly in focus, but those little circles are much, much smaller. So I'm going to go back the other way so we can watch them slowly get bigger. The camera is going to go overly bright, and then it is going to figure it out and return the image to, I believe I'm at ±0 for exposure. So there is our f1.1 little bokeh balls in the distance. This is again at minimum focus. We're at minimum focus and maximum aperture. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll my focus forward. Focus on that furthest most light. Just about right there. Now, what I'd like you to do is look at these lights that are in the foreground, that are on the tripod on the left side of the screen. Those lights are now out of focus in the same way that the ones in the distance were out of focus when we were close focused. That is because of the convergent rays thing, right? It is where the rays are not impinging on the sensor in one infinitely small point. It is where they are hitting the sensor at a gap, giving you a circle. If you notice, they are not a circle. They are a cat eye. That is referred to as a cat eye shape. This is because there are elements in this lens that are physically limiting the aperture of the camera. So when you get towards the edges of this lens, some of the lens elements are actually blocking light from some of the lens elements further back. Because of that, we are going to see two things. One, we're going to see this cat eye bokeh, and that's essentially that the light can't corner around the lens correctly. You're getting blockage from another lens. If you think about that, you're actually kind of seeing a Venn diagram of where the light is going through on the various lens surfaces. You're seeing a Venn diagram of essentially where the light's coming through on all of the lens surfaces, but generally it's only two surfaces that are going to create a cat's eye style bokeh. The other thing, you will see vignetting at the edges of the image. The edges of the image will be darker than the center. I think on this lens, they're like 2 or 3 stops darker at the edges than they are at the center. It's actually really, really bad. And you're gonna see that pretty much most lenses that do mechanical vignetting that show cat's eye bokeh are also going to show pretty bad vignetting. It's two symptoms of the same disease, and that is essentially just trying to keep an aperture open too wide for the pieces of glass that are in the lens. The aperture blades in this lens are curved, and I believe there's 13 of them. So as I crank down on that aperture, you actually cannot see, and I'm going to focus in, so we're at minimum focus again. You cannot see the edges of the aperture blades. On lenses that have fewer aperture blades, you will actually be able to see the shape of these little bokeh balls change. If you had 3 blades, it would show up as a triangle. If you had 4 blades, it would show up as a square. Most lenses have between 6 and 19, I guess, aperture blades. What that does is that the inside of those are bent, and for most of the aperture range, it will give you a very spherical or circular bokeh. And you can see that as I stop down, even if I go down to f2, where you should be able to see the sides of the blades, you don't see the sides of the blades at all. It is very, very round. And so some lenses have more blades to give you a cleaner bokeh. At wide open aperture, the blades are all circular. They haven't cut in on each other yet, and you don't see edges. So every lens wide open should, in theory, have circular bokeh. Now we can show this with some other things. I have printed some aperture discs that you can just set on the front of the lens. On this lens, again, because we're getting some mechanical aperture, some mechanical vignetting, you're not going to see them. So this is a little piece of plastic. I'm not in focus. There we go. A little piece of plastic that I'm going to put over the lens. And what this is going to do is this is going to act as a false aperture at the front of our camera. It's going to limit light to just coming in on that star shape. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, you'll see. So this is going to give us a false aperture. Our real aperture in there is that circular one that we can stop down to allow less light in. So I'm going to hold this on here. And now look at our bokeh balls. Oop, let's not drop it. Look at our bokeh balls. They are in the shape of that star. And if I rotate it, you can see I can rotate, so I'm making a false aperture. So if I had an aperture that was in the shape of a star, all of my bokeh would look like this. Is there any good reason to do this? Not really. Some people use it for artsy purposes. I do not. But it is a valuable way to see it. Now, if we slowly stop down our aperture, I want you to notice that the stars are not getting smaller. Did you see that? I'm going to open it all the way up again. Watch the stars. The stars don't get progressively smaller because if you think about it, the false aperture of the star is not moving. That aperture is going to be the same, which means the shape of the light coming through impinges through and shows up as a star. What I am going to do, though, is crank down the normal aperture, so we're essentially multiplying a circle times, or dividing, however you want to think about it, subtracting against one another. We're subtracting the circle from the star, just like here I have a full aperture, and then I'm subtracting out to just get what's left in the center of the star. Now if I crank down my aperture slowly, you will see the legs of the star simply go away. The legs of the star will go away until right about here. And here is where the aperture in the lens is smaller than that center point of the star. And so you don't see the star multiplying with that center aperture. You just get, one or the other. One thing that we can do is if you look in the bottom left corner, you can see that they're not full circles anymore. They look like, little comets or something. And the reason that is because we're getting that mechanical vignetting. We're getting that double aperture thing on one of the edges of the lens element and our pretty little star. So only right in the middle, that green star that's right in the middle, the one that's upside down right now, that green one is right in the center, so that's going to be the cleanest star. And then as we get to the edges, because we have this mechanical vignetting, we're going to get that star multiplied out by the aperture, and it's going to cut our shape. So remember, we're just kind of cookie cuttering the light as we come through for the shape of these bokeh balls. Another thing this will do is if you have flares, you will get the shape of the flare will be one of these multipliers of the internal lens elements and your apertures. So you can kind of actually see the internal construction of a lens just from the flares that it gives off. So I'm going to take this one away. And now I'm going to use, let's see if you guys can see that, a square one. Now look at how big this square is. I already said that this lens has bad mechanical vignetting. Do you think we're going to see the square edges from this? Let's find out. So yeah, so we can see a little bit of this square, but we can also see that the round is cutting into it. We're not seeing the edges of this, fake aperture. We're only seeing the very center of the edges when it's kind of multiplied by that circle. And when I rotate that, you can see the rotation of the sides. And now let me just do something very simple. Here's my hand. If I just put my finger right in front, you can see that I can just cut the bokeh ball in half with my finger. And the camera can actually, to some extent, see past my finger. Right? If I use a thinner instrument, I'm going to use just a little scraper tool. You can actually see the shadow of that scraper tool on the bokeh ball. And you can do this with any objects. You can also shoot through things, like if you shoot through leaves or through a forest, you can see it as well. Here's an example of a more complicated filter. See, this one's just a bunch of circles. So you can see that it makes all the little bokeh balls circular. And one thing to note is that it's not doing this just on bright pinpoint lights. It's also doing it on the background. If you look to the left in the background, you can actually see the shadows on the wall start to move as this filter interacts with them differently. See that area over there? And then let me focus out. And then these foreground ones are going to do the same thing. See here, you can really see that mechanical vignetting as I roll this through, right? You can really see how this is literally just a Venn diagram of those two shapes. And kind of on a simpler note, I just want you guys to notice that these front two lights, if I make that orange one in focus, the blue one already starts to blow out. We can't get two lights that are maybe an inch difference for their distance from the lens in focus at the same time. But if I focus out to the middle of this string, I can get 2 or 3 in the middle in focus. If I go out to the very end of this string, I can get the last like 20 lights pretty well in focus. And what's happening here is, again, we are converging this light. So the closer we go, the sharper that X is, the harder the convergence is. Whereas the further we focus out, we can get our convergence, to be shallower, and so more things can be in focus before that convergence diverges, and we lose that pinpoint to pinpoint conversion. So do realize that focusing closer is going to blow out the background more than if you focus, in the middle of the string at about 10 to 12 feet. And then you look at those little bokeh balls at 25 feet, and they're much, much smaller than if I focus down to my minimum 2.5 or so. So realize there's a lot of things going together to make an aperture give you the image that you're looking for. They're not all the same. Not all apertures are created equal, and the aperture is not just to control the amount of light coming into the lens. It does all these other things as well, and it's just something to keep track of. And before we move on, I just want to show you this little bit of footage. I've actually increased the shutter speed of the camera to 1/200th of a second, and you're seeing this horrible, horrible flashing. And what you're seeing is you're actually seeing that the lights themselves are flashing at about 1/30th of a second. And because of that, and because of the way electronic sensors work, the electronic sensor is constantly scanning down the image and giving us picture, 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 picture. And when our shutter speed is faster than the cycle time of these lights, that gives us a flashing. So all of those LED Christmas lights you've seen are actually flashing very, very quickly, and we just don't notice it. You can actually do this as well by spinning them in space, and your eyes can start to see the difference. Okay, so we're outside. I want to show some late night, just what bokeh looks like through different things. So we can see that if I just look at some bushes, right, just some bushes, sorry, there's going to be some road noise. We can see that as I pull that out of focus, there's no real point source of light that's going to give me those really heavy circular bokeh balls. But as I move over here and get some light through from the other side from a parking lot, we can see those bokeh balls again. So if I focus out, you can see those point sources of light. And as I pull in, you can see that those point sources of light become those big spheres, or those big circles that make up bokeh. When we go in the middle, we get, half and half. And now here I want to show you some failures of older lenses and brighter lenses that are not, properly costed. If you look at that rainbow, this is not related to the aperture. This is actually one of the failings of just kind of old and busted lenses. That rainbow is just a failure of the edge of the lens, or not the edge of the lens, but it's a failure of diffraction in the lens. It is, however, quite interesting and quite attractive for those people that are into that sort of thing. One thing I want you to notice is that the tip of that, especially when I go out of focus like this, at the tip of that rainbow, you are seeing a little kind of second ghostly bokeh ball. That is that lens flare that I was talking about, and that lens flare will match the shape of the lens in the same way that the bokeh ball matches the shape of the lens. So you can look at either the shape of bokeh, or you can look at the shape of lens flares. So here we're outside, and I want you guys to notice the bokeh balls getting patterns on them. You will see as cars drive by, there are some plants in the foreground, and you can see when those plants are you can see when the plants are in front of the light sources, which in this case are some car headlights way down at the end of the street. You can see that I can actually put a leaf in this bokeh ball in the top right-hand corner. And see that one go by, and all of a sudden it picks up patterns when it's behind that bush. See the patterning on that? And then as it gets clear, the false aperture also becomes clean, right? You're not getting the false aperture of those bushes, you're just getting the single aperture of the camera itself. And actually, it's interesting, you can see a false aperture and actually get a pretty good idea of the plant that's in the foreground, and that is a tomato plant on a trellis. But it's very weird in video that you can see these false apertures as essentially shadows on your image. But can be used to great effect, or just make a bunch of very silly images for a while. There's a bunch of cars going by, you can tell because there's a white or yellow dot followed by a red dot. See, there's a car right there in the center, stopped, pointing to the left, right? White dot in front for the headlight and red light in back for taillights. And it just turned, and it's coming up the street, so we're getting a lot of light out of those headlights, which is giving us that rainbow. Yeah. It's a neat capability, and there's our tomato plant. It's a neat capability, and it can be used for good or ill. It's up to you guys to kind of figure out what you want to do with it.